The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts. Imagine being in a large sailboat that has been separated from its convoy and gets caught in a violent storm. Your ship wrecks on Florida's coast. It's more than 3 centuries ago, so the nearest city is St. Augustine, which is more than a 200-mile walk away. Between here and there are groups of native people who you believe might be cannibals and could consume you and your family at any time. In 1696, a ship called the Reformation wrecked on the southeastern coast of Florida near Jupiter Inlet. A man named Jonathan Dickinson was among the castaways. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. First published in 1699, Jonathan Dickinson's journal has become a valuable resource for historians, archaeologists, ethnographers, and literary scholars.
So in the fall of 1696, Dickinson, along with a couple dozen other people, including a Quaker missionary, his wife, his infant child, half a dozen or so sailors, and 10 or so enslaved Africans, shipwreck in southeast Florida amongst the Hobe Indians, who are a subsidiary of the larger group, the Ais Indians. And they spend several months on foot, in boat, being passed along through different groups, from Jupiter Island up to St. Augustine. With the help of the Spanish, they're escorted from the main Ais village to St. Augustine and then prepare for the second leg of the journey, taking them from St. Augustine to English, South Carolina, and then ultimately in Philadelphia. And so within the journal, Dickinson recounts not only their experience as captives, but also the nature of society in these various different indigenous communities and their relationship with the Spanish and the larger Atlantic world.
Jonathan Dickinson was a late 17th century Quaker merchant. He came from a fairly wealthy Quaker family, plantation-owning family in Jamaica of English descent. And at the time when the journal was written, or shortly before the journal was written, he was in the process of traveling by ship from Jamaica with a convoy of other English ships in order to eventually make his way up to Pennsylvania with, he had his wife, his child, some family members, a lot of materials in the ship, as well as, it doesn't get talked a lot, but he owned, enslaved people, and so he had 10 people that he was transporting as well, in the hopes of starting plantations up in Pennsylvania, which he did.
After the shipwreck, he and his party, those who survived, managed to get to Philadelphia, and the Society of Friends, who are better known as Quakers. And that was wonderful because Fox, one of the founders, and this story may be apocryphal, but when an Episcopalian minister told him, you need to be more rational in your worship. You want your followers to quake before God. And he embraced that, said, yes, we are Quakers. And they adopted the Quakers. But the Quakers have a memory of them as very liberal in their philosophy. And he got to Philadelphia So the shipwreck occurred in 1696. He got to Philadelphia, and the journal was edited. There's still a lot of debate about who is most responsible for the final product. But it was published in 1699, and it became an enormous bestseller. It was one of the most important books in the colonies and also back in England.
How he wrote a journal, it's after the facts. So he's recalling all these facts because, one of the first things you learn in the book is that the Native Americans took basically everything from them multiple times. They would go from one village and they would lose everything. They would be given something. They'd go to the next village and they'd lose it all again. So he's not walking and keeping pen, quill, and vellum dry and capable at the time. So it's really a recollection of what's happening along the way.
Dickinson shipwrecks in 1696 in Florida, midway on a journey between Jamaica and Philadelphia. And in the 1690s, things were pretty difficult in Jamaica. There's a fair amount of unrest and political uncertainty that was compounded by some natural disasters, particularly an earthquake in 1692 and a French invasion in 1694. So in the 1690s, the family looked to kind of expand their interests economically. And Dickinson, along with his other brother Caleb, left Jamaica for two different locations. Caleb went to England, and Dickinson, on his way, shipwrecks in Florida to Philadelphia, where they were trying to establish reciprocal trade relationships to support their plantations there on the island. And having shipwrecked in Florida, and ultimately surviving and making it to Philadelphia at the interest of the Society of Friends, they asked him to record the events that are published in our journal here.
He was probably keeping a ship's log before the wreck, and some of that may have been salvaged, but certainly while he was traveling, these, couple of months, that he would not have been able to keep a daily log, even though that's sort of how it's presented. So he most likely wrote it or dictated it to someone else upon arriving in St. Augustine.
And there were lots and lots of captivity narratives at the time. They had actually started with captivities by mostly Europeans among the Moors, and among the British was Brits who had been captured by the Spanish and forced to work on their ships, and then it escaped. But the captivity narrative goes really back to much earlier, and it continues on. It's always been a very popular theme. In the 19th century, it evolved, and the focus became much more on women being captive, and that's carried over into the 20th century. And today we have works like The Handmaid's Tale and Orange is the New Black, which are really modern variations of that captivity narrative.
So Dickinson's account of his time in South Florida is simply the only English source we have regarding the indigenous people there. Now, there are a handful of Spanish accounts from Pedro Menendez Ford, but they're very brief at best. And so Dickinson's account is a sustained account that talks not only about their experiences, but more importantly, the nature of the Ais, their civilization, their relationships with each other, both internally, but also the relationships externally with other groups, and the wider Atlantic world, particularly the Spanish in St. Augustine.
The captivity narrative was actually married to the shipwreck narrative, and those are two of the archetypal stories. And shipwreck narrative goes back to the Odyssey, Shakespeare's Tempest, Robinson Crusoe, Defoe's most famous novel, and today we have Tom Hanks in Castaway and Matt Damon in The Martian as modern versions of that shipwreck. And marrying the two of them gave this a double punch for the audience.
What I'm really fascinated to learn about is the wrecking, the practice of wrecking the ships, how Yeaga and many other, Florida indigenous people were really adapted to having these spoils of very exotic European goods washed onto their shores. They readily incorporated these goods into their own indigenous systems of trade and tribute and moved them around the state. And we see that with the Reformation, Jonathan Dickinson's ship, which after removing the goods that they wanted from the ship, the Jaeger then basically burnt it down to the waterline. The indigenous people on this coast at the time were very politically savvy. They knew who the English were, they knew who the Spanish were. They knew that someone was going to come looking for a ship when there was a shipwreck.
The discussion of the Native Americans, of course, they had no voice. We only know them through interpretation. We have nothing from them. And they were an enormous community at the time. And Dickinson and his party spent their initial time with the Jaeger, and then they were passed up to other communities. And so much of what we know about the indigenous people comes from this and some of the other captivity narratives. But so of course we're seeing it all through a European lens, and in this case, an English lens.
In 2023, a newly edited version of Jonathan Dickinson's journal was published with fresh perspectives from Amy Turner Bushnell and Jason Daniels. The book contains an additional contribution from Gerald T. Milanich. Most intriguing is that the book contains previously unpublished material that Dickinson wrote in 1696. That material was cut from the journal that was published in 1699. That previously unpublished material was only recently discovered by Jason Daniels, buried in an archive.
I first came across Dickinson's journal as an undergraduate student, and once I went into graduate school, I wanted to pursue understanding what happened on either side of the journal. What was his life like in Jamaica, and then what happened to him and everybody else after this harrowing experience. And Dickinson ultimately settles in Philadelphia and then dies there in 1722. So a lot of his personal records are archived at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And so I began my research there, and I was very interested in not only his personal experiences, but also the nature of trade between Philadelphia and Jamaica at the turn of the 18th century. And as I was researching, I stumbled across what was a miscatalogued manuscript copy of God's Protecting Providence, the actual published account of Dickinson's narrative. What was fascinating about that account is that it was drastically different than what we thought to be the only source on the shipwreck and the people of South Florida. Certain things had been rearranged, other things had been cut, some things you could say were censored by the Society of Friends or the Quakers who first published the journal in 1699. And so what's new and exciting is a rich kind of trove of ethnographic material, as we would call it now, that was excised before publication, and also some discussion about the various competing interests of different parties amongst the castaways. Fascinating new stuff.
The new material offers a lot of insights into more of the daily life of the journey from this area, the village of Hobay, up to St. Augustine. There's more ethnographic detail that perhaps wouldn't have been interesting or deemed important to the Quaker audience, that the later manuscript was clearly heavily edited and made for, as a religious manual, basically, on how to, have enough faith that you're going to survive the cannibals of Florida. In the new, older manuscript, the 1696 one, which presumably is more authentic, it ends at St. Augustine, unlike the earlier one. And so that has led the authors to question whether a lot of the ethnographic material recalled by Dickinson was because of the Spanish interest in learning about the ice. So they may have really been kind of intensively interviewing him about the ice.
The new material gives us, I think, a more realistic insight of what was going on. So the journal itself, the original version that we all have read and known, and it's kind of sanitized. It's kind of, I don't want to say whitewashed because it's really not whitewashed, but it's an idealized version of what Quaker life and ideals were supposed to be. The new journal kind of shows a different reality, and that's critically important. It also gives quantifications, which for an archaeologist is very important. So where the original journal is saying, oh, we had this and this and this, the new references are saying, well, we had 14 of this, 6 of that, 7 of these. That's critical information for historians and archaeologists. So it's an amazing find.
So Dickinson records all types of things from familial relationships, ceremonial actions, the nuances of communication between different groups. He also talks about bitter infighting that almost tore the castaways apart that is cut out from the journal. He talks about enslaved peoples using kind of the subversion of the normative social order for their own agency and elevation within that system. Really kind of expanding upon a complicated narrative in ways that make us think more critically about who's telling the story, how they're telling it, and what narrative they're trying to tell to that audience.
In the 1696 manuscript, we learn about that some of the Englishmen were really, and some of them I think were from the shipwreck of the Nanwich, but were really acting out, really, I think they just thought they were going to die and were going to have a good time in the meantime. You know, I'd always heard how, of course, the Dickinsons were, for good reason, in fear of their lives. It was an extremely scary, very uncomfortable, very unpleasant journey. But in terms of of them being, say, starved, you find accounts of that the ice actually stopped giving the party fish because certain members of the party, certain of the Englishmen, would just steal so much fish from the ice themselves, and then it would rot. And so the ice were basically, no, we're not going to give you guys any more fish. That's in the older manuscript. That's left out of the newer one.
This shaped the way the Quakers viewed this book and was part of the motive in wanting to publish it. And that was that it encapsulates the journey motif, probably the most fundamental archetype of literature. And it's deeply influenced by what was the most important book in the colonies after the Bible, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, where Christian goes through a series of harrowing adventures before finally achieving salvation. And it's the same model as in Dickinson's journal.
There was an account in the older manuscript of an enslaved woman named Sarah who made friends with the Ice King and really made life more difficult for the Dickinson party than it would have been otherwise. And that's a really amazing story that blew my mind when I read it, and that's left out of the more recent, more sanitized version. So some of those behaviors, I think, that wouldn't have been, that gave a glimpse of really real life and people really trying to survive, but it wasn't really palatable for Quaker consumption at the time.
Well, the title of the book is God's Protecting Providence. And so the idea is that if good Quakers are well-reasoned and put their faith into God, they will be brought out of any dire circumstance. And so the journal tends to highlight the disruptions caused by the shipwreck, the perceived violence, the privation, the whole shipwreck ordeal at large. And ultimately, what they're trying to illustrate, like I said, a patient and faithful Quaker will be delivered from these kind of inhumane circumstances that they're put into.
So one of the most interesting differences that I noticed between the 1696 and 1699 manuscripts was a discussion about Jonathan Dickinson's young wife, Mary, who had a 1-year-old infant who was breastfeeding. And we know from the previous accounts that she was having trouble producing the milk, and sometimes the Indigenous woman would help her breastfeed. And in the account we already knew. At one point he talks about how there was a Indigenous woman who'd recently had a baby and could not produce milk. And he basically says that, despite Mary's ill health and everything else, that she almost demanded that Mary share her milk with her baby, and Mary consented to this finally. In the older manuscript, we find a really kind of touching story about Mary going out in the Shell Mound barefoot. Her feet are destroyed from this journey, to actually seek out this woman who she knows has a baby who's hungry. She walks over to her cottage and calls out to her and says, please let me feed your baby. So that's a really stark difference about something, really basic and really human. And I don't know if that was changed just because maybe it would seem indecent to some Quaker readers for Mary to have offered herself in that way. I don't know, but that really was a amazing difference.
Well, the Andrews and Andrews is the definitive text up until this point. Is the only scholarly treatment of Dickinson's journal ever to be published. And it's not that Amy and I have better questions, it's that we have new questions. The way we understand colonial America has changed. The paradigms that we examine, such as the Atlantic world and Indigenous interactions with Europeans, are different. And so I think we come at it from not a better angle, but a fresh angle that speaks to the concerns of historians in the 21st century. How do people interact? How does that inform international relationships? How does that inform how we understand Indigenous politics? How do we understand early American publishing, censorship, just the nature of examining documents, every 70 years is important. Re-examining those things from different angles provides new perspective and elevates narratives that may have been intentionally or unintentionally silenced through the past generations of historical research.
So Bushnell and Daniels really deserve kudos. They've done a fantastic job on the book. What's so important about it, and especially the new information that they found, is it's really the only descriptions we have in Southeast Florida. There's a few others, but really we don't have the people here that were present in other places of the state. So we don't have these great descriptions of what the Native American life was like. So as an archaeologist, we read this journal over and over and over again, trying to extract as much information or insights or even inferences that we can make regarding his travels through the area.
We always have to reinterpret the past through our new experiences, through our new sets of values, the way we have found more material, and we've redefined the way the world is. The world that I live in, the world I taught in, was radically different at the end of my career from the beginning of my career. It had become much more diverse. Students had changed their value systems to a great extent. They were much more sophisticated. They had far more knowledge about some of the most extraordinarily abstruse subjects that they could bring into play. And they had a whole different vision of the world. And I think that becomes really important. There was an abstract expressionist artist who was doing an interview with students from NYU. And at one point, the students asked him, "How does the past influence you?" He paused and said, "The past does not influence me. I influence it." And he meant that we can't look at Renaissance art after having seen Picasso and Dali without their shaping the way we see Renaissance art. In much the same way, we can't read Civil War history without understanding where we now are and what's happened since that period. And so I think one of the things that is a special virtue about new editions is they bring new knowledge, but they also force us to reread it. And in rereading it, we can rethink it.
The new edition of Jonathan Dickinson's journal, or God's Protecting Providence, an early American castaway narrative, is edited by Amy Turner Bushnell and Jason Daniels with a contribution from Gerald T. Milanich. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Find us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts.